so.
So, welcome to this presentation by the League of Women Voters of Evanston on our recent national election, featuring David Orr by voice or in person. David Orr is uniquely qualified for this analysis. As the Cook County Clerk, he oversaw Cook County elections for 28 years. His earlier political career included 3 terms as alderman of Chicago's 49th Ward, serving as vice mayor to Harold Washington, and as mayor of Chicago for a short time after Washington's death. After retiring as county clerk, Orr founded Good Government Illinois, whose major goals are protecting the vote, advocating best practices for government, and electing progressives to office. All attendees will be muted throughout his talk, but you may put any questions for Mr. Orr in the Q&A chat box throughout his presentation. They will be addressed at the end as time allows. This session is being recorded and will be available on the League website.
The video. So you have to tell them that they have to accept me. They have to allow me.
I'm about to introduce David, but
I think that's David's wife trying to get on.
Yes, let me
Yes.
on. This is Kim Bobo. Can you let me on and I'll get David on?
Hey, Jane, if you could do that.
Yeah. So Kim Bobo, if you could accept the video and sound for Kim Bobo.
Jane?
Kim, are you an attendee? Because what we see right now is that David Orr is here. It's just a matter of revealing your webcam. So if there's a way you can adjust the setting on your Zoom to start the video, that is your webcam.
He doesn't have it up right now. Can you accept me instead?
I would have to, you'd have to be in separately as either an attendee or as a panelist, Kim.
Okay, but can I just talk? Unmute me?
Mm-hmm.
You're definitely there to talk.
Yes, if you just unmute me.
You are unmuted.
Okay, well, I'll
can hear you
unmute
both.
him, and if you can let me be seen, then you can see David.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and what you need to do is go to the bottom corner of your screen and turn on your webcam. There's a way to.
I don't know if that's going to work. We'll see.
Okay.
Worth a try.
At the bottom, there are 2 icons. One is for muting and one is for video. And if you click on that with your mouse, you will either mute yourself or you can start your webcam.
Honey,
the computer has a it has a camera.
You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, how frustrating.
Why don't we just go ahead and talk, and maybe we'll get it figured out. I don't know. We lost power here, and I'm not sure if that had to do with that. My computer usually works for Zoom, but are we ready to go ahead?
Sure, you could start your presentation.
Okay, let me just go ahead and start. I'm sorry, I think it's a little crazy here. But first, let me thank Gloria and the rest of you at the League. Tell you quickly how we have such a long history together. I remember a couple of fascinating things. We worked together very carefully to force Governor Edgar many years ago, when they were not obeying the national law for the motor voter law. You might remember that was back in the 90s. Bill Clinton had passed the law nationally. Other states were implementing it, but Illinois refused. And over a couple of different lawsuits, working with the League of Women Voters, we managed to force the state to get rid of what they had at that time, a 2-tier plan. The other thing most people probably don't know is that we wanted to have a way for people to see more about the candidates. We couldn't do it legally in Illinois, So we came up with this idea, we're going to do an online voter's guide. Started with my office at that time, county clerk, and League of Women Voters. And it was actually very successful for some time. So let me just, because I don't mind getting to questions since unfortunately I'm late on all of you. Let me just say a couple things. A fascinating election. And remember, when we see some of the things that have happened, we have to remind ourselves that in the US and in alleged democracies, elections decide power, and we can't ever forget that. Power in government, particularly at the federal level, can be enormous, hundreds of billions of dollars. It can make or break some powerful people. It can make or break countries. So we should never be surprised that sometimes people will do anything to win. And we've certainly seen that very much so in this election. So there was amazingly a number of wonderful things that happened. It's amazing how we have so many heroes and villains in this particular case over the last few months. But let's start with probably the biggest impact on all of us was COVID and how that forced changes in the election. And first of all, how it meant, and remember, I can't see you all right now, but I assume some of you are election judges, so you know this stuff pretty well. But it meant that everything changed for a while, that your polling places often be too small to be safe because of COVID. You're not going to get the number of judges that want to work. You're not going to get the number of election day workers, all sorts of problems caused by that. To Illinois' credit and to some other states' credit, remember, people tried to address the COVID phenomena by providing more opportunities with mail voting. One of the great things they did here in Illinois was to give us a holiday. And not only did a holiday, it allowed us in many places where we'd had a small room, but with schools closed, we could have big rooms, which made it safer for those people that voted in person. And the holiday also allowed for the first time, which I've always wanted, the 120-some thousand educators in the Cook County region, if they wanted to be election judges, they could have been. So that COVID certainly was very critical. Beyond that, let's talk about mail just for a few minutes, because that was so critical on all this. From the outset, the challenges in dealing with mail were one, of course, not just the president, but other people who did their best to disparage mail voting, kind of imply that it's crooked, all sorts of other arguments like that, which made it difficult. And then, of course, the various suppressions started in. One critical thing about mail, which I think many of you know, but let's just touch on it briefly, is that the president was saying months out before the election that the votes should all be counted that night. Well, of course, that's, literally impossible, particularly because of the mail, okay? And that meant states do it differently. We, fortunately, here in Illinois, we're way ahead of many others who basically prepare all the mail balloting before election night. And so one of the big problems is some of the swing states, as you may know, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they don't have that same process. And ironically, Republican legislators, well, there's plenty of decent ones. In this case, those legislators blocked any attempt to start preparing those ballots ahead of time. And those of you that are involved in this, and I assume some of you are, but I can't see you, remember you've got to open thousands and thousands of pieces of mail. You have to sort them, which is extraordinarily difficult in places like Cook County. You have to check signatures, which involves using Republican and Democratic judges. So enormous amount of work. And when you can start ahead of time, that means you can push the button at 7 p.m., at least in Illinois, and have all the ones you've already counted be uploaded immediately. And that was very important that we did that. Let me just say something briefly about suppression, not go into it a long time because I think people know it, but there was some pretty amazing suppression efforts. And what I mentioned before about heroes, there are legal groups and activists that kept battling on every single day and they won a lot of the battles. So it could have been much worse. We really don't know how to calculate how much damage was done by suppression. I don't want to overdo it, but I never want to underplay it. Never want to underplay it, because I think it has more effect than people realize. And while we were able to stop a lot of it, like I say, by some of the legal groups and some of the victories we had, even victories by Republican judges that stopped some of the antics, particularly in the swing states, those were really wicked, wicked things. And we don't want to forget them, because they will keep happening as long as certain people think they work. Okay. One of the worst, of course, is the whole felony issue, where, remember, the voters went to all that trouble to pass the state resolution that would allow felons to vote by an overwhelming margin. And then Republican legislature put in changes that unfortunately the court upheld, that said you still couldn't vote if you still had fines and fees out. And there were some Herculean efforts down there to try and help those people, but literally many tens of thousands of people never got to vote. And that's just Florida for one. One of the things that was pretty serious, it was a serious problem. I think overall it worked out okay, and that was intimidation and the challenges. Again, it's important to have challenges, but fortunately, most of the challenges, at least from Republicans in this case, were in places like Detroit and Philadelphia. And while they got ugly at times, challenged every voter, basically the judges did it correctly. They said, if you're here only to challenge every Democrat that walks in or every black voter, we're not going to listen to you. But they attempted that in many places. We can talk about the lawsuits later if you wanted. I know people wanted to hear turnout figures. And of course, some of them are still coming in, but it was pretty remarkable. Let me see. And I know you're asking about Evanston numbers too. So it looks like, and remember, these numbers are voting age population. As clerk, we almost always talked about registered voters who voted. But the projection, at least the ones that I've got, the latest I've got for 2020, is about 66.8%, which would be the highest, perhaps on record. We had a 65.7 in 1908. By the way, our lists, I think, are much cleaner than they were in those days. We only had about 6 states that may not have broken a record, places like Idaho and Wyoming. We had a number of states with more than 75% turnout: Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Connecticut, New Jersey. Even Texas broke an 1892 record by over 5 points. So there was a lot to be said about the turnout. I know there's some questions. Illinois, I don't have all the numbers there, but it was lower, probably because it wasn't a swing state, which is one of the problems in having the electoral college and the old-fashioned stuff. So at some point, I can go right to questions if we want to, though I would like to talk about what we could do better on election law or other kinds of things, and talk about some of the structural reforms that this country, is facing and causing very serious problems for us, including the electoral college. But if you'd like, because of time, we could get right to questions.
I think we have time.
So like I say, because we're not set up here exactly the way we want. So you can do it however you want. Have someone read the question, or you could read the question.
Talk about what you wanted to talk about. There's time.
Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about another big problem that I didn't go into, and that's kind of misinformation. That, the world is changing, our means of communication are changing, and I'm always looking to things that I think hurt the democracy, okay? Hurt the chances of people wanting to participate, or various reasons why they can't trust, or they don't know who to vote for, they're confused. Crazy things like the way we elect these retention judges, 70, 80 people, nobody knows who they are. It's a terrible way to do it, but at this point, we're stuck with that. So obviously the misinformation starts with the president and his followers, and enormous damage done in that way. Now, I'm not an expert on digital or social media, but one of the things that's been going on, we should know that, and you see more and more things coming out in the press, is millions and millions of dollars have been spent, both by the Russians and others, to use the digital information they have on all of us, what kind of toothpaste I like. The bottom line is that's been going on. This campaign didn't just start recently. It's been going on for years, where if you have the money and the ability, you can target those individuals. And because of the level of misinformation, we've all, maybe you twist the truth a little bit sometimes, but we've kind of reached a peak at that. And not only are people doing it, like the president, but we have enormous networks and or significant outlets, I want to call them news outlets, who can pass this information to millions of people very quickly. That might explain why many of us can't understand why there's so many Trump voters. But they have been working very diligently for years on a digital campaign to get information. And I got a right to do that. It's the misinformation that is so dangerous. Like the misinformation that comes out every day from the White House now, that he won the election and it was stolen, et cetera. Another thing related to, we hear so many things about elections, but we should, at least my experience is, okay, most of our problems, not about suppression, most of our problems that are running elections are human mistakes. Okay, they're not the equipment. We hear all things about the equipment. Almost every one that we've heard that are being trumped up by various right-wing groups, they've all been fairly easily attacked sufficiently by other news outlets, in some cases the courts. But just for example, so many things, like I say, are human mistakes. So when a few years ago, when a judge made a mistake, let's say in Cook County, an election judge, because they didn't realize that the precinct they were in had two different ballot styles, which means you and your neighbor vote for the same congressman, but you may have a different state rep. And if you only have the one ballot style and you give it to everybody, all those people, the other state rep, are getting the wrong ballot. Now, of course, some people don't even know that because they don't know who the state rep is. And so that's a human error. We knew it. The judge made a mistake, wasn't informed, whatever the reason was. You bring in more updated technology or touchscreen or whatever. And in this case, the judge pushes the wrong number, okay, when they're preparing what ballot you should be getting the touchscreen. And maybe they push 126 instead of 128, and the same thing happens. But now it's a conspiracy, okay? And the latest conspiracy, again, by the Trump people, is attacking one of the biggest election equipment organizations, Dominion, which we have in Cook County. And we picked them way back in 2006 for that election because they're only one of the major folks that had a paper trail. So when you move to electronic voting, it's critical that you have a paper trail. But now, I don't know, Larry probably remembers, and some of you remember, way back in 2006 or so, when the competitors, particularly ES&S, which is another enormous firm in the US, when they lost the contract with Cook County and the city of Chicago, back then, they started a campaign, a 2-year campaign, fairly vicious, a lot of lawsuits, did everything possible to try and knock Dominion out. At the same time, people like Ed Burke at the time began saying how Dominion was controlled by a right-wing Venezuela outfit. Well, I guess in this case, they called it a left wing. Anyway, because it was owned by, part of it was owned by a foreign company. Dominion now is a Canadian company. And so I don't know if you follow this stuff, but Trump and all the allies now are making up all sorts of stuff about Dominion, including things that happened in Michigan. So that misinformation, it's not just on elections. It's so much broader than that. And I wanted to tie that for a moment to where we are as a country and the campaign. And I said before that I really worry about the advertising. Okay, let me give you two examples. The New York Times today reports a big story about Susan Collins. And the inference in the article is that there were a number of people that didn't really like Susan Collins, but were so ticked off by the outside interference and the viciousness of the campaign that they ended up voting for Susan Collins. Another example, I know of a woman who was running for a Democratic a House seat, congressional seat held by a Republican. She was one of the Democratic candidates, and she had a minority person against her. Now, in this case, and this is all over the country, the people that we see as the leaders here, Emily's List, the key Democratic organizations, they started a campaign, a vicious campaign, to wipe out this woman who happened to be a military colonel or somebody, a pilot. And this happens all the time. So it's not just Republicans, but both parties are wasting so much money on my mind, highly paid consultants who often don't know that much, but they spend a fortune on these vicious attacks. And of course, we've been seeing that for years, but it's only getting worse. And as a democracy, we don't really have a way to deal with that. For example, other countries have tried to limit social media. Other countries will have things like no TV advertising the weekend of the election. They try and have a cooling off period. But if any, these are some of our heroes, if you want to say that. I mean, not mine, but people who are very high up in like Democratic circles that are doing this as well. And it's kind of thing like, I will do anything to win. Okay. And I just think that's extraordinarily dangerous. I think it has something to do with people, losing faith in government. So any questions yet?
Yeah, David, if I may jump in, this is Jane Grover again. A couple of questions to kind of clarify your remarks, getting to the voter turnout numbers, the percentages. The numbers that you quoted, was that of registered voters or eligible voters? Thanks, Sue, for your question.
Yeah, what I reported, those numbers were eligible, okay? And that's always a lower number, like, often we're 72, 73% for registered voters. But that amazingly high record of 66.8, I think of what I mentioned, that is eligible voters, okay? Meaning some of those may not be registered. So that's a higher bar.
Yeah.
Sorry,
another quick question from Elizabeth is, could election equipment potentially be programmed to determine a particular result?
Could they be fixed?
I think that's the question. Could it be programmed to determine a particular result?
Well, it certainly could be programmed. In other words, many of you might remember a gentleman named Noah Prates. Noah Prates was my last election director, who is now one of the most highly regarded election cybersecurity experts in the country. He actually worked for the individual that got fired by Trump, who had the audacity to basically explain to Americans how many of things coming out of the White House were simply not true on the cybersecurity front. So the point is, the way you approach this is yes, it could happen, but it hasn't happened. It really hasn't happened much. Let me give you an example. Yes, for example, we used to send people to Las Vegas where the hackers would get together, okay, and brag about they could break into this system and change something in literally minutes or seconds, okay. And again, that I do think there are dangers there, but I also like to point out when they were doing that and bragging about it, they were doing that in a room, okay? There was no judges, there was no watchers, there was no voters. And I know if any of you, again, are election judges out there, and somebody comes in with a bunch of equipment and grabs one of the machines and tries to open up the back and insert some malicious software, whatever it be. If that's the way they were doing it, well, that's just not realistic. It's just not going to happen. People would say, what the heck are you doing? But there are sophisticated ways that danger could happen. So the key, at least to the experts, is that you have to be able to mitigate that, okay? Mitigate that. When this gentleman who was just fired from cybersecurity stuff from the White House, he said this was probably the most secure election we've had in years. Partly, I would say that's because we had more cyber experts out there working. One of the things that, like I mentioned, Noah Prates and myself working on a couple of years before I left office was getting the state, this was a national program, getting the money and then get, at least in Illinois, for example, getting cyber security experts to help the counties, okay, particularly the smaller counties. Unlike Cook or Lake or DuPage, the smaller ones may have 15,000 voters. They might have 3 people in an entire clerk's office for elections and vitals and all sorts of things. And no offense to them, but they often do not have the staff that we might. And there were many of those provided. Sometimes they work for several different counties. We don't know the effect of that because there's just not the data. But I will tell you this, we went ahead because we couldn't wait for the slowness of the bureaucracy. When I was clerk, we went ahead with the city of Chicago and hired our own cybersecurity expert. And we had good people before that. We hired those people and I don't think we're going to get hacked anyway. Unfortunately, we didn't, but they were able within just a couple of days of being in our office saying, you've got vulnerabilities, okay? And so they saw things that other people didn't. So that's the direction we need to move. We also, I think with a different president, pardon me, this is just me talking. I don't have any doubt in my mind that President Trump has a deal with Putin, whether it's money or who knows what Putin has over him. No president ever has sided with a communist dictator over the American public on a regular basis from summer 2016 all the way through his presidency. So we do need what I think Biden and his people will be able to do is be much tougher on that, reviewing it. So back to the key point is you can never stop a hack necessarily. You can do a lot of things to reduce the possibilities, but the key is have things in place to mitigate it, okay? And a lot of things we have is when you have a paper record, which we do and most of the country has now, that's really important. If there's any kind of various sabotage, or it could just be fires and stuff, when you have a paper record that's separate and you can always recreate the ballot and therefore the votes, you're in pretty good shape.
Great. Building in that redundancy. Thank you. So Gloria has some questions, and we've got quite a few as well in the chat and question boxes. So Gloria, if you want to, we'll just trade off back and forth.
Sure. What would you see going forward for election reform?
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would start, I would love to see more universal. In other words, this notion that this all belongs to 50 states, this is, in my view, as archaic as the Electoral College, which I might want to talk about if we have time. But we really should not have different counties with different policies, or allowing individual clerks to interpret things differently, or having all this different state stuff, okay? Now, I understand we are a federalist society, more or less, but mostly the states' right argument is used in suppressing ways, okay? So I do think the more uniformity would be a good thing. A counter argument to that is, oh, well, by having the states, you get all this local creativity, which is fine, but you're still going to get the creativity. But the point is, when you come up with good things like mail voting or early voting, it really should be more universal. So that's one. I could go on. I mean, the one I talked about before, we're going to have more mail voting, because as people get used to it, they like it. There is some evidence that it can increase turnout. So whether COVID goes away or not, it's going to be around. And so we need to make that work better, which means to, like I said before, allow laws so people can prepare the ballots, so you don't have the situation of starting to count 500,000 ballots, or small counties having to count 3,000 or 4,000 ballots with their 3 or 4 staff. So that would be significant. And again, everywhere where you can, I don't want to have too much power in the hands of local clerks, okay? One can always be creative in their jobs and try and be more efficient in their jobs. But you know, the example, I've probably talked to this before, but so we put early voting in Illinois, very proud of that. And I think it's been great, but there's too much leeway left to the clerks in terms of sites. And some of you remember, like in Lake County, for example, the former clerk from a while back, she refused to put any early voting sites in the most populous parts of the county, which happened to have large Black populations. Okay. And at that time, it forced Terry Link, that name you know now, Senator Terry Link, to try and pass a state law to counteract that. And the gentleman down in Champaign did his best to put the early voting site for the University of Illinois as far away from campus as possible. Those are examples. That stuff shouldn't happen. There should be more regulations there, okay? I could just...
Gloria, do you have another question?
Any advice for strategies for higher turnout for elections? Although we're doing well.
Well, let me just point out, number one of the things I already, let's talk about process and other things. And let me just remind you of what I said a couple minutes ago. I didn't really talk about money, but money is destroying our democracy. Okay, so keep that in mind. And so we need to reform that. And I've talked about various things to do. We have to really look at the dark money. We really haven't done much as a country on that. California has started in some good ways. And what I mean by that, you know, whether you agree with the fair tax or not, okay, to me, it's a no-brainer because it provides more money and the vast majority of people don't have to pay for it, which to me forces those with more ability to pay to do it. And yet that went down in Illinois, okay? And we know some of where the money comes from. We need to know where the money comes from, both in races for judges, in various statewide referendums. It's a real danger sign. And I don't want people to say, oh, well, look at the Democrats have done pretty well. Okay. This is not something to help the Democrats. This is what should be for national policy and state policy. So I was saying, you know, one is as California is doing some good things in dark money, but so money is one. And I mentioned before the terrible campaigns. In fact, I would think, I can't think of a better group than the League of Women Voters or some other groups. See, this takes like moral suasion. Like I say, because these are our friends that are doing some of these things. And no offense, but you know, our friends in the Chicago Teachers Union did all these rumors. Lori Lightfoot doesn't have a black bone in her body. Lori Lightfoot is a corporate hack. Fritz Kagi is a Republican, you know. So when I talk about this national stuff, this is not just national. This happens everywhere. And it's kind of like the Trump phenomenon of lying. Once it gets started, how do you stop it? Okay. Now I've said maybe the legal voters, you just need some people with some moral suasion at some point to say you can't do that. But the money, not rewarding these people that do these things that I'm talking about, that's what I don't like. I don't like the National Democratic Party because I can't really speak for the Republican Party. I don't like these people getting rewarded for what I believe is bad behavior, bad government, et cetera. Um, um,
We've-
so, if
We've
you
got
deal
a-
with, if you deal with those things, and one other thing is part of our big problem is our citizenry does not understand politics, period. Not much at all, okay? And groups like the League of Women Voters are very helpful, and not just a civic education, that I think is important, but really understanding politics, because when you have government that's unaccountable, which in many cases, unfortunately, we have, that adds to people's unwillingness or inability, I don't trust any of them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, when I talk about understanding politics, is really we need to focus a bit on the right-wing groups, okay, with enormous amount of resources that really are working day and night in their mind to make our country better, in my mind, to sabotage the democracy, like the Koch brothers, and several books have been written about this. And they use enormous amounts of money to do some of these things. So, I mean, all the things that angers people, the lack of fair redistricting, you know, and this could easily go right into some of the structural problems. I mean, why in the Obama presidency, when did 40 become a majority? When, even if you had, you know, 59 votes, you couldn't pass anything. I mean, we need to understand our history. I don't have to go into that now if there's other questions.
There are, and Gloria, if I may, we've gotten, looks like a little consensus on the next question about the Electoral College from Cindy, Betty, and Jennifer, who wondered, do we keep, reform, or abolish the Electoral College, and what's the likelihood of any change?
Well, the likelihood is not good, but that doesn't mean you give up on it. You know, we've all been involved in things where the likelihood when we started did not look good. Let's just be very practical. Most of you know the history, but the problem with Electoral College is it was developed for a different era, a rural country that was just formed, in which we had 13 states, some big and some small. And the small states, New Jersey said, no, we can't have everyone just elected by popular vote because Virginia and New York will kill us. Okay. So there was that famous compromise. Okay. And we can say that was fine for that time. But people act like, oh, if we had it then, we can't change it. Well, what did we also have then? That African Americans count as 3/5 of a vote, that women couldn't vote, blacks couldn't vote, all sorts of people couldn't vote. So over the years, we've changed. So that's one thing we got to understand, even though it's difficult to win some of these red states of this change, it's the right way to go. I believe things like that need to be discussed, because they need to discuss this thing, which is very unfair, and that is senators, 2 from each state. That's why we have this, because of the it's related to the Electoral College and on the battle, small states, big states, et cetera. Absurd to have 39 million voters in California and roughly 1 million in Idaho. I'm not sure if those numbers are correct anymore. I believe it's important for people to push a lot of ideas. They may not sound exactly doable at the moment, but we may catch a wave one of these days, and it's the right thing to do. These things where, and that's going to relate to the court if we want to get into that, where a particular institution can kind of block almost every issue that I'm aware of. There is a majority of people on one place, but we don't go there, okay, because of these structural reforms, either a Senate that's controlled by small states, okay, a redistricting, which is outrageous, and the Supreme Court does nothing. What I mean by that is, you know, there's something wrong is if your state votes Republican and you have a dramatic majority of Democrats in your state legislature, something's wrong. Okay. It's not so wrong if you have a state that votes Democratic, you know, on a statewide race and so forth. You expect to have more Democrats, but that has been happening, and it's horrible in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Texas and other places, but our court has refused to act. So what I'm saying, there's people work on the Electoral College, and that takes states to support it and so forth. So it is a tough battle, but there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. Okay. And it's really a question at what point can we convince people it's in the public interest, okay, to have a fairer system. Okay. Who knows? Maybe 5 years from now, someone say, well, let's have a compromise. Okay. We're not going to change the electoral college or the exactly the way we do it, but maybe we'll say, you know what? Let's give the 5 biggest states one more senator. I don't know. So now we have 105 senators. But I think we have to look at these structural problems. And like you see, at least Democrats arguing for it, that, you know, Washington, D.C. should clearly be a state. Puerto Rico, if they choose to be, should be a state. There's various ways to skin the cat, but it's important to keep talking about it. This is fundamentally unfair. It doesn't have to be. This is not 1776. So tough hill battle, but I think very worthy of talking about it, pushing it, because you never know when your minority side becomes a majority.
I have another question here. If you could, David, reflect on the work of local elected officials, our county clerks who are doing the counting, notwithstanding the snafu in Wayne County, Michigan. How are they doing, and can we trust them to protect and maintain our democracy at the local level?
Well, I would think, and what I mentioned before, we have the villains and heroes, and we know some of the villains, but the heroes to a great extent are the election apparatus people, not just the judges, the people that work in these offices, the county clerks, in most cases, secretaries of state who run elections. In most cases, we've seen not only a willingness to deal with COVID and trying to come up with constructive suggestions, but the way in which they run the elections. Now, of course, it's driven our president nuts. And the New York Times keeps reporting it, you know, that they go out and talk to all these local people and they say, no, we didn't have problems. Things weren't rigged. That's terribly important. Just think if people would talk about the structural problems I just was discussing with that kind of openness. That put a tremendous burden on Trump and forced some of his Republican colleagues to back off some of the rigged stuff. So it's very important, and it shows that job, if done right, and most of them do it right, is really critical. So I do think that that's partly where some of the heroes come in, particularly. So with the COVID on one hand, and this assault largely from the president or some of his minions and his sons and so forth, with this attacks every day, the system's rigged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think that bodes well for the country. Again, they've requested money for things that the Congress did not give. They requested more money to prepare for the mail. You know, just an example of that is that people need to understand the real world is you can't go from, in a small county, you know, 750 mail ballots to 16,000, or the big counties, 120,000 to 500,000. You can't do that without adjustments, okay? And many of those clerks are saying that, we need sorting machines, we need this, and we have to do it in a COVID atmosphere, which means we may not even have a lot of workers there. So yes, and I think while they probably don't get all the praise they should, I'd say they've been really, really important in this battle for the soul of our democracy between the White House's allegations. That really makes me happy.
Great, thank you. Gloria, did you have a question?
No, I know Jennifer has one.
We have a bunch of questions. We could do really quickly right here, a lightning round. So David, yes or no to 3 things. 1, 16-year-olds, should they vote?
Yes or no, huh?
Yes or no? You can comment.
I would lean toward yes, but I'm not sure how much preparation we need to do.
Okay.
So, I mean, I remember 16-year-olds are they can be awfully talented these days, although sometimes when I see these kids out there with the COVID stuff, I want to take away the 18-year-old vote.
Yeah. So another quick question, ranked choice voting as the state of Massachusetts just voted to do. What are your thoughts?
I think ranked choice voting has a future. You know, I don't want to say just because of money, but that's also a factor. And particularly some of the recent things with the kind of bitterness and so forth, that has options. If someone is more suitable for a second or third choice, that's good. You know, I kind of like the parliamentary system in Europe in some ways. You can be a small group of only 10%, but you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of representatives, more or less. And we don't have that. And one of our other big problems, which I didn't address, why we have, you know, it's hard with the turnout. The electoral college means that Illinois' vote doesn't mean anything, ironically. But anyway, I just think there's
Okay.
more we can do there. Go ahead.
Right. All right. So another question is about a lot of some folks complain about voter fraud, others complain about voter suppression. Could you address some of the issues with voter suppression, the cleaning of the voter rolls, the efforts to get in the way of and create barriers to access to the polls? Are there ways to address this?
Well, yeah, I said before that I think voter suppression is an extraordinarily serious problem. So we know that. We talk about the felons, we talk about some of the lists, I didn't really talk about some of the legal challenges. Some of the dirtiest stuff is that they knowingly bring these legal challenges like they did in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, other places, very late in the game. Florida on the felons, they bring it late, hoping they'll have a sympathetic court, and then the lower court might rule in their favor, and there won't be time to do anything about it. So that's a big problem. What can be done about it is we've kind of done a lot. Support these groups, okay, whether it's Republican or Democrat, but these groups that are really trying to do the right thing. And we were helped out here in some cases by a few moderate Republicans left, and they're standing up on some things. You know, the decision by the Republican judge in Wisconsin to stop the games they were playing in Wisconsin, the decision to allow votes to be counted if they were legally mailed by election day, at least in Pennsylvania, for 3 more days. In Illinois, we passed the law they could arrive for 2 weeks. Okay, it wasn't until yesterday. That's why yesterday people have to get all their provisional votes done and stuff. Is that since we know there was a 2-week wait in provisional, we said, well, let's have that much time for legal mail ballots to be counted, because I saw ballots mailed way before the election come in 2 weeks later. I saw FedExes come in a week after the election, even though they're sent the Friday before the election. So I just think those are examples of things.
This year, the state of Illinois made Tuesday, November 3rd, a state holiday as Election Day. And for a couple of reasons. One is to get more people to volunteer to help on Election Day, but also to encourage voting. A couple of questions there. Do you see this becoming a regular thing in Illinois? And are we forever stuck on Tuesday in November as our election day? There are other countries in the world that vote on other days at more convenience, or has mail-in voting now eliminated the need to adjust our election day?
Well, first of all, yeah, the holiday is really important for the reasons you mentioned, particularly COVID. I'd like to see that continue. I really believe the presidential election should be a holiday. We could go ahead and do it. We could do it like we started here in Illinois. So that was a holiday. What was the other thing you mentioned?
I am muted. I'm
Things in there.
Are we forever stuck on Tuesdays, the first Tuesday in November, as our presidential election day? Or are there ways to encourage more voter turnout by changing the dates so that more people can get to the polls? Or
Well, I don't know that that's going to happen federally. I think what we've always tried to do realistically is what we've done is, number one, allow people to vote early, allow people to vote by mail, and the things, and of course, making that particular day a holiday for all those reasons. Yeah, that's going to, I think, continue to be a good incentive. So it's really hard to change the national thing, again, for the kind of like the electoral college, you know. And so you also asked about almost every country in the world votes on weekends, usually a Sunday. So it's a holiday, and we're one of the few that don't. very few.
Tuesday. Gloria, did you have any, we are at 8 o'clock.
Just a brief one. The lack of civics education in American high schools, I think, is a real problem for our voting population. What does David think?
Oh, I agree. But I think it's deeper than that. Pardon me for, my political analysis here.
That's why you're here.
There's a lot of battles for the soul of the nation. Okay. And there's a reason why the right wing, and I'm not saying they're all bad. I'm just saying the right wing and people that believe that way have a very specific agenda in many cases. And part of that specific agenda is, in my mind, destroying, too strong a word perhaps, but weakening public education. Okay. And you take all the polls and what the results we see, and when you see the least educated voters voting one way, you can understand why. They know that. They've got tons of money invested in this for years. Now, it's not all because of that. Most of the movement against public education is more to get the money. Okay. They want the money because what's the biggest expense we have in this country, at least, kind of locally? Schools. Okay. And what the politicians want, I'm sorry to generalize like that, is, wherever the money is, that's more goodies, if you believe in the old system, the old machine or whatever. And so that's why people are always after that money. And the right wing, and not just the right wing, but others who want money, okay? Businesses, you create all new businesses like we've seen around schools. And if 53 cents of every property tax dollar goes to schools, you get an idea of how much money there is. I've been upset by some of what I call the old line Democrats in Cook County have been moving this direction for years, taking over local school boards, in Cicero and all sorts of places where they could get all sorts of money for things that shouldn't be spent on. I think we should need to change that.
So we are 8 o'clock, but we did start late. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, I do. I'm sorry about that. I'm glad the power came back.
Our apologies for the technical snafus, and thank you to both Gloria and your spouses for helping us solve them.
Sorry you can't see me, although I'm just an old guy.
And your
here.
voice is very impressive.
Okay, good.
And I'm pretty sure that all the attendees, the participants here, would love to be seeing your face, David.
Well, like I say, I can't see, but I do hope we have some election judges out there.
I'm sure there are. So will Illinois ever go to all mail-in voting, as many states already have?
Maybe. I don't think it'll come right away. Here's one of the ironies that without the reform of the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in the early 21st century after Florida's colossal failure in 2000 and a secondary failure in 2002, that gave about $3.9 billion to all the election officials around the country to buy new equipment. If that hadn't happened, I think we'd have much more mail voting today. But when states like Illinois, you can get the money to buy this new equipment, that's the way it went. I do think the good thing about mail is it's improved dramatically. It used to have a higher problem with votes that don't count, okay? But we're getting better and better at that. I think it would help turnout. I would love to see the experiment. For example, let's talk about the local elections. Some of you remember one of the things that I'm proudest of years ago is that we used to have in the odd years elections in February, April, and November. And November was the school board elections. And I started working on that a few years into office, and it took a while, but we actually got that changed. One, because the turnouts are miserable, 2 or 3 or 4%, but you still had to have your precincts open. And so we converted all that to the spring elections. So I think, well, how do we put it? I'm not sure where else to go with it, but I think it's going to be hard. We're going to move in that direction. I think there's other elements that don't want that to happen in both parties. But I think if we kind of do an experiment, particularly, remember, we started with some cases special elections. Okay, so we need the authorization in Springfield, but I would love to see that. Just think if we did some of the local elections coming up in, let's say in your cases in April, that'd be pretty darn dramatic. Which of course I really do think it's a good direction to go. I think what Illinois might follow, because there's many groups working on this, we were started before we left, is a combination of all voting by mail, kind of like following the Colorado model, that it's most everybody can vote by mail, but you still have some regional centers, some polling centers, some real big places. And the only problem with that, I think it's generally a good idea. The only problem with it is you have to make sure for that second part, voting centers, whatever title we call them, that for those people who want to vote in person, we don't want to make it too difficult. So now, of course, you got smaller precincts and most people can get there pretty easily. When you get voting centers, so there's not as many of them, you don't want to make the old lady, you got to take 2 buses, you know what I mean, to get there. So that's about the only reason to worry about that. But I think that may be coming to Illinois. I just can't tell you when, because Colorado's worked well with it.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Gloria.
Well, I think that it all worked out well. All things worked out in terms of learning a lot from David. And we thank him for all the effort put into this. And you gave us a lot to think about and to act on as a League of Women Voters. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. My hat's off to the League. Keep up the good work. There's being the League of Women Voters person like you all. Let me just end with this. That reminds me of Emma Goldman's biography. Well, I think what you call it, like Reform in Paradise. If you're someone like the League, folks, that cared deeply about democracy and making elections where you never going to have too little work to do.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Just a reminder that next month on December 8th, we'll be talking about the criminal justice reform on Tuesday, December 8th at 7.
Can I say one last thing?
Oh, sure.
I just remembered I'm supposed to push that any of you that are interested in following what we do at Good Government Illinois, at some point, you might look us up on the website or goodgovernmentillinois.com. Where we can't do all the things we were doing before because of COVID, but like tomorrow night, we're having a virtual discussion on the city budget with Finance Chair Scott Wagasback and Alderman Matt Martin. So we do lots of programs like that. We try and focus on best practices, worst practices. So
I just posted the link in the chat box. If anybody wants to click on the link, you'll have the website.
oh, thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.